All right, welcome to Service API's office hours for September 23. This could maybe be a short meeting, I'm not sure. We have a dwindling release checklist, which is always great news. I want to focus today on the few PRs. I think there are 4 PRs I've identified that are super close to being mergeable. Maybe are, all feedback is resolved and there's some form of LGTM, but not official LGTM on it kind of thing. So that includes the TLS on route listed here. That includes potentially gateway selection. This one we're going to talk about more today, the gateway class authorization. Well, we'll probably talk about all of them, but there was an interesting alternative proposed for this. But I think the PR itself is mostly good as it stands. And then finally, backend policy also, I think we've mostly reached a consensus on. And then today, James' PR for gateway status got in. So that leaves, I believe, gateway class as the remaining primary resource that needs conditions added to it. There may be additional work needed, but we're getting awfully close. I have a absolutely massive API cleanup PR that is a mess right now. I started it and then I wanted to prioritize getting my other PRs in first, just so that I wouldn't constantly be rebasing against myself, which I started doing. And so I'm hopeful that we can get a bunch of PRs in today or next 24 hours and then really make progress on that API cleanup, because I think it's fundamentally close as well. It just needs to be split up a bit and made easier to review. But that's my understanding of where we are. Beyond API cleanup, we also have a lot of work to do around documentation, and even some improved testing to verify CRDs would be fantastic. But I think that's it. I think that's everything for V1 Alpha 1. If anyone knows of anything that is missing on this list, definitely let me know. I also linked here to the milestone itself, because this in some ways is more up to date. This includes a lot of things that are already underway. Some of these are covered by my API cleanup PR. And the reason I did just one massive PR is it felt like anything like admin items to all fields is going to just conflict with anything that, admin length. You're going to be changing the same thing, very similar fields in very similar files. So it felt maybe less bad just to try and chunk that up into a larger PR. Anyway, that was the rationale for that. Yeah, that's the status of everything as I understand it right now. With that said, let's take a step back and talk about backend policy for a second. Backend policy was or is an interesting concept. There has been some hesitation around the concept of a resource at all, and then there's been separate hesitation around how generic the backend policy name is. And I thought, oh, well, I can solve this with one of those cool Slack polls and we'll have a really clear consensus on what to do. And unfortunately, there wasn't quite the same consensus that appeared before. I'd say there was a very slight preference for keeping the name as backend policy. And because that is the path of least resistance, that's what I'm tempted to do. But I don't know of anyone that feels very strongly on name here. I think the two favorites were backend policy and backend connection policy here. So at least for now, my preference is to stick with what had originally been proposed. The one thing that I know had kind of been mentioned in the documentation for backend policy, but was never really documented well, was kind of in the back of my head. I'd been thinking maybe we should allow some kind of superset pattern here. Because so GKE, we already have some kind of CRD that is similar in nature to backend policy, but it includes a lot of implementation specific things. And we know we can't, it doesn't really make sense for those implementation specific bits of config to all live in open source. And there are limitations as far as what can be done with extension refs. You don't necessarily want an extension ref for each little, policy, annotation, whatever it might be. So an idea that I had, which I think may be a reasonable compromise, is to require all implementations to support backend policy. And backend policy is where core configuration lives. But implementations may choose to provide their own version of backend policy that includes all the same fields, all the same config as backend policy, plus implementation specific config on top of that. This is a pretty different idea, and I wanted to throw this out there and see if it sounded like a terrible idea or if it would be useful to any other potential implementations. And to clarify, I'm not saying, I am still saying everyone should still support backend policy. I'm just also saying, if you want, you could also do this one other thing.
So that sounds like a promising idea. What if you support backend policy and you have another CRD to support implementation specific things, right? Like things like TLS we have TLS right now in backend policy. If you want, let's say, health checking, you have another policy that is implementation specific if we don't settle on an API in the core or extended part. That does lead to CRD explosion. So
Yeah.
having one CRD does help with that.
Yeah, that is exactly the problem we've been trying to deal with, because we already have that, that kind of custom implementation specific config. And we're trying to grapple with this idea of, okay, so previously users would have to configure ingress and this, CRD, right? And now we're saying, okay, you have to configure gateway class, gateway, route, and backend policy, plus, our implementation specific stuff. So like you say, CRD explosion is a good term here. I don't know. There's definitely potential messiness with the kind of superset pattern I'm describing here. It's all trying to find the right balance between, complete isolation and somewhat reasonable user experience. One of my concerns with two completely separate CRDs here is that, as an example, some users may, it feels not obvious to a user why some things appear in one CRD and some things appear in another CRD, and then I don't know.
I agree with that. Like I get that feeling too. So I understand that.
Yeah, and it's not, this isn't something like we absolutely have to specify at an API level. I mean, this is fundamentally, you can be compliant with the API. We're still requiring that everyone support backend policy. It's just an interesting approach that some implementations may want to choose, but I'm not sure. We definitely have not decided on this approach internally. It's just one of the things that I've been exploring as an option. Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts on that kind of pattern? All right, well, we'll keep on moving. Mike, I had what I thought was a really interesting idea, and we talked about it some at end of last week and into this week a little bit. I linked to a comment that I think is maybe the best description of what he was proposing, but maybe Micah, do you want to take a few minutes to explain what you were thinking here?
Yeah, I can try to explain. So, right, in this PR, you're suggesting, or you're proposing the gateway class should say, these are the namespaces where a gateway can select routes, right?
In this case, it's where these are the namespaces where a gateway can use this class.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think I had that backwards. Right. These are the namespaces where a gateway can use a particular class, and that's a specific API field, and it's kind of the intention there is kind of access control, right? And it feels like kind of an odd API to have in there, like this field that's related to access control when we have a whole RBAC system where you can define cluster roles and role bindings to configure RBAC. So my suggestion here was, instead of specifying it in the object, in the gateway class, you specify cluster roles to say this role allows you to create a gateway, the gateway class with this name, or gateways of this gateway class. So you would define roles. You might have one role that just allows you to create any kind of gateway of any class, or you might have more, this role can create these fancy load balancer gateway class gateways, and this other role can only create more basic, maybe less expensive gateways of a simpler, more basic gateway class. And then, right, yeah, this is a good illustration. So the suggestion is you would use RBAC to say this role can use this gateway class by gateway class, the gateway class's resource name. And then you would bind that role to a service account. My suggestion was the default service account in a namespace to allow whoever has control of that namespace to use gateways of the gateway class in question associated with that role. And the default policy could be allow any authenticated user to create any kind of gateway class. That could just be the default policy, default cluster role, and role binding. And if that doesn't satisfy a particular cluster's needs or cluster administrator's needs, then that role binding can be modified or deleted, and more fine-grained roles and role bindings can be defined. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great description of this, and I'll just say my personal perspective on this is that I love the idea of using RBAC for this. Where it started to throw me off was just this last bit of what you're binding to, because and this is, I guess, where as I've been thinking about it more, I've been trying to find any component that we could add that would have both access to the resource and the authorization, and the user or group associated with a request, right? Because it seems like, with a validating webhook, you just get the resource. And with authorization, you just get the authorization and the resource name, but not the actual resource content. That's my understanding. It's hard to find something that would enable us to actually bind this to a user or a group. And that's what I would absolutely love to have work here, because if this could work like vanilla RBAC, this would be the dream, in my opinion.
Okay, well, I think that should work fine. Maybe I'm kind of used to thinking about service accounts, but the subject in a cluster role binding or role binding can be a user or a group. I don't think
Right.
there's any reason that wouldn't work in this case.
No, yeah, I get that. Yeah, it doesn't, I guess to me, it doesn't matter so much whether it's a user, service account, group, whatever. The problem is the actual thing that is creating a gateway. Like the way that you've defined this, as I understand it, is you are granting this access to a namespace. You're not granting this access to a service account. You're granting it to the namespace in a kind of indirect way, right? And so this can happen within that namespace, not X user can do this.
Yeah. So yeah, this example here is kind of my attempt to model what you're doing in the PR, that is, to enable it for a namespace. Maybe we can step away from that model. I'm not sure why I didn't suggest this before, but yeah, we might as well say this user or this group
Yes.
can create gateways of this class. Is there any? Yeah, that should be fine. That should be possible with the cluster role binding here. If you just change in subjects instead of specifying kind, service account, name, default, you can specify a user or a group.
Where would we enforce that? So the RBAC there is perfect to me, but I just don't understand how we would enforce that.
Right, that would require an admission controller that can perform the subject access review and reject if you don't have this use permission for the gateway class in question. And that would be an additional piece that we would need to implement.
And does an admission controller have access to both the Kubernetes resource in question as well as the authorization, so the users or groups associated with the request?
I believe so. I might be missing some detail there, but yeah, I think that should be possible.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's where I was getting hung up, was finding the place inside Kubernetes where we could actually implement this kind of custom authorization, where you, like, as I understood it, so like a validating webhook, as I understand it, you just have access to the resource. You don't have any concept of who's trying to create it. Is that correct?
I think you must have, you must be able to tell who's trying to create it. Otherwise, well, I need to look more at how admission controllers actually work. I can try to put together a proof of concept to make sure that is possible.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this, if we can find a way to do this with RBAC, I am wholeheartedly in favor of that. That feels like, especially what was throwing me off with this proposal is that it was binding to something that didn't feel natural, but if we can find a way to bind to the actual user performing the request instead of this can happen in this namespace, that feels amazing to me. My one caution is that this may end up being just too large of a change to try and get in pre-alpha. But I am open to feedback, ideas, whatever on that. I will, from my perspective, even if we roll with this proposal of a selector in V1 Alpha 1, I can't imagine anyone is going to be upset if we change that to use RBAC in the next, we deprecate this concept and instead suggest using RBAC. I don't know. I'd be interested in just understanding in the next, I don't know, a couple days if it's possible to use RBAC for what we want to do. I don't know.
All right, I'll work on a proof of concept. It's been a while. I've done admission controllers before, but I'll do a proof of concept to make sure this specific approach is feasible.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, because I know you can do the like what you're saying. You could do a subject access review. See, I thought that the way you proposed it, this way is because everything you'd proposed you could do with only seeing the resource. You didn't need to know what user was performing the action. You could do this entirely based on the gateway and what namespace it was trying to be created in. But if you can not just see that, but also see the user or group or service account that is acting on that, even better. Yeah, this is an interesting idea. I know I've kind of said most of the feedback here, but I should open it up. Did anyone else have any thoughts or ideas on this kind of approach?
Just the only thought is that I do agree with what you mentioned, Rob, is that I think for V1 Alpha 1, kind of stick with what we have and then explore this direction afterward. Yeah,
this feels like a lot of work to get right. And I think it would require having some kind of controller to even really be able to implement it, some kind of shared controller. So my personal preference is to push this to V1 Alpha 2, but that does not mean to slow down looking into it, because I think I'm really interested in this approach. I've been struggling, as we've all seen, for a long time with finding the ideal approach here. I think a namespace selector is, at least there's some prior art in the term, like network policy or something like that, but it is never particularly loved. It's a thing that works, but if we can use RBAC, all the better, because like I think many have said, this is primarily an authorization problem.
And it's like there are benefits to both ways, right? I mean, taking the approach that Mikhail is suggesting, we're utilizing existing RBAC facilities instead of creating something new. But on the other hand, it's like a lot of people don't understand RBAC, and with the namespace selectors and so forth, it's just an easy concept to understand.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you're completely right.
All right, I'll work on a proof of concept and some more examples. And yeah, it's fine. I don't object to. I don't want to hold up the V1 Alpha 1, so I don't object to working on this as a proposal for V1 Alpha 2 or V1 Beta 1 or whatever.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. I appreciate this proposal. I think I think it's worth digging into a little bit more. Yeah, great.
So maybe I missed it in here. If you go back, so is there like a separate issue that either Micaiah you've created or should be created and kind of port over some of these ideas to that issue for tracking purposes?
Yeah, that'd be great, Micaiah, if you don't mind creating a follow-up issue just to kind of maybe summarize the proposal that you've already made in these comments. Can probably copy a lot of this content over. It'd be great just to track progress on that separate of this PR.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thanks. Okay, and with that, I think we're good to move on to PR triage. I'll say, you know, this may be far too optimistic, but in my ideal world, I'd love to get, you know, I think there are 4 PRs that are just super close. I would love to get those in the next 24 hours. And then, you know, ideally, again, perfect world, I'd love to spend part of tomorrow's meeting going through the cleanup PR. I think there's a few more things I'd like to discuss as a whole there, but I've already gotten some great feedback. Thank you to everyone who's already reviewed it. And once we get these kind of impending PRs in, I can do a rebase, clean everything up, and there won't be quite as many conflicts. So that is my goal here. With that said, let's start. You know, we'll get through all of these one way or another. So I don't think that the order matters too much. This is the bidirectional gateway selection. We've talked about this a few times. I don't think there's going to be any surprises left in this one.
There is
one. Oh, there is? Okay.
Yeah, so I was going to approve it, and then I figured that I think that it is not possible to list a gateway from another namespace. So you know how we have a from list, we don't have that. So yeah, we'll need to change that, and we also don't need a name, a group, and a resource here, right? Because we know that we are referencing a gateway here.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. Yeah, so I really just need namespace. Thank you. That is beyond obvious. I will fix that. Yeah, good catch.
Yeah, I got a drop. So see you tomorrow.
Okay, thanks. This is apparently why every PR should include examples. And I'm pretty sure I did not add an example here. I'm sure I would have caught it then. So yeah. Okay, well, otherwise, unless there's any, you know, additional feedback on this one, I think this is just awfully close at this point. Was there anything that has anyone left feedback that I have somehow missed or not responded to on this one? Cool. All right. The next one I want to run through, Backend Policy. This one also has some form of unofficial LGTM here. And this, you know, was actually just Harry deferring to Danian in this case, since I know you'd left some comments as well. So not to put you on the spot or anything, Danian, but if there's anything that's left over on here, let me know. Otherwise, I think this may be good. And yeah.
Yeah, I need to take a look at all the PRs in the queue today. I've been wrapped up in some other things. So
completely understand. Cool.
And I'm not sure at this point, can I /LGTM it or do
yeah, you can absolutely do that. I need to ping Bowie to make sure he approves the maintainer's PR, but yeah, you can so /LGTM is any member of the Kubernetes SIGs org, which I think you are. And so yeah, feel free.
Yeah, I am.
Cool. And then there's just a couple tiny ones left. The Downstream TLS one, I added, Harry has resolved all feedback. I'm pretty happy with how this looks now, so I added an approve, but wanted to, defer to someone else, doesn't matter who, to add a final LGTM on this one. But to me, this PR looks good. I think, Harry added, I think, 3 different examples now. And otherwise, I think it's in a good place, in my opinion. And then the very last one that I'll cover is actually, no, we should, okay. So this one is generally LGTM given our last conversation. Again, I think this was just waiting until we could resolve this conversation. Maybe as soon as Mike Kaya creates a follow-up issue on this, we should go ahead and get this one in. I think this is probably also good to go. And I mean, really, I hate to rush these in, but I would just love to get these in so that, follow-up PRs don't have to rebase a bunch as each of these go in one at a time. And the very last one is this one. And maybe we should talk a little bit more about naming, because naming is always fun. It's funny because, yes, this is the allowed gateway namespace selector was a painfully long name. Your suggestion was gateway namespace selector. I elsewhere am suggesting allowed gateway namespaces. And both of these kind of come from the world where gateway class had fields that related to both route and gateway. And we got rid of the route field. So we could even potentially, shorten this further to be, namespace selector or allowed namespaces or anything like that. I don't know. I don't have a super strong feeling on this one. I think I prefer allowed gateway namespaces over gateway namespace selector, but I don't know. Damien, what was your motivation for name change here?
I mean, mainly brevity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the names suggested here in this comment, do you have it sounds like you might prefer gateway namespace selector over allowed gateway namespaces.
Yeah, the other piece of it first was brevity, and then the second part of it is I looked at just some other instances in the APIs and saw kind of the suffix of selector, and so I think that's why I went with dropping allowed and going just with the gateway namespace selector. So
that's fair.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I don't mind that. Do you think it's important to say gateway here? Or could we infer that because this is by definition gateway class? Like, could we get away with just namespace selector? I don't even know if I'm suggesting this. I just wanted to throw it out there for the sake of brevity.
Yeah, we probably can. Let me take another look at the PR and just do one last kind of pass over and see if I feel otherwise. But yeah, otherwise namespace selector I think will work.
Yeah, I don't feel too strongly on this one. As long as, I feel like gateway namespace selector, allowed gateway namespaces are both equally easy to understand. I don't mind, selector, there are a ton of fields that have selector as a suffix, and that is clear how that field should be used. So I get that idea. And then, again, between namespace selector and gateway namespace selector, yeah,
I'd also be open to dropping the selector suffix. And either doing the allowed gateways or gateway namespaces or something like that. I don't know if I mean, with other fields, do we kind of add a suffix for kind of, for the type? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, not necessarily, but I think the more I've thought about this, the selector suffix probably does make sense. And the reason I say that is we have a concept of route namespaces on gateways, and that is not a selector directly. It's route namespaces dot selector, like there's a selector field inside of it. So if we had a gateway namespaces field that was a selector and a route namespaces field that wasn't, I think that would be confusing. So given that, I do think a selector suffix probably does make sense. It also allows us in the future, if we want to support it, to expand this to have, say, a list instead of a selector. I don't know if we ever will, but it does make it clear that this is purely a selector, not a list, not anything else. Yeah. Cool.
All right, yeah, let me take another look at this, as well as you see, I wanted to put a hold on it until 285 merges, just because I didn't feel like this was worth messing up any of the work on 285. So we'll just wait for that to merge.
Perfect. I appreciate it. I think we're getting awfully close here, and yeah, hopefully we can get a few of these in the next 24 hours or so, and I'll be shifting my focus over to this cleanup PR, and I think we've got lots and lots of work to do on documentation if anyone has some time to contribute or reviews.
And on the documentation, I've started to just kind of think about it, and there's an issue on one of the docs, or one of the doc issues that I commented on. The user guide, I believe, is
oh, right.
You can go there. Or did I not add it here? Go back. Maybe it's the cook. Is it the cookbook? Or no? I guess I didn't.
Yeah, I did have a cookbooks issue, I thought. No comments on this one either. I don't know.
I wonder what happened there. Anyways, let me go ahead and comment on that. And basically, I was just trying to kind of sketch out, okay, what do we want the user documentation to look like, right? I mean, like when I think of the user documentation, it's like, okay, install the CRDs, and that's, are we gonna, is it simply that easy of make install, right? And then, like the configuration piece referencing some of the config samples. So let me make my notes there. I had it, and maybe I just didn't save the comments and my Mac updated on me.
Yeah, let me dig into this too, because I think Mark had worked on some kind of he's a PM here. He worked on some kind of user guide that could be generic enough that any implementation could be plugged in, at different parts. And so maybe we can use some of that here, but that doesn't answer the full concept of how we should structure our docs as a whole. But I think you're right that we need to think through exactly how we want to structure a user guide in a reasonable way, right? But also in a way that's kind of like, I think someone had mentioned this last week, that's kind of like the current ingress docs, where there's references to all different implementations of the API.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the ingress docs, because that's what I had pulled up to just
Yeah.
try to use that as a reference. And so, my mind is basically saying, okay, our docs should be pretty similar to what I posted in the chat window. And it's not necessarily like the way the current doc site is organized. But I think using this as a reference model, and then obviously we're dealing with more than just a single resource like Ingress. But in my mind, I was saying, okay, let's use this as kind of the starting point, which kind of covers all the different things from like how example installation and background of what each of the resources would be like.
Yeah, and we have this secondary section, which is about different controllers that this all makes sense. This will be a good resource here.
And then I thought also, just from a user standpoint, is like having that comparison of, okay, here's the sample ingress and here's what it looks like with service APIs.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's actually a great point. Having some kind of side-by-side comparison, especially I think what we're going to, well, almost all of this is going to be a translation between ingress and HTTP route. But I think that would be very helpful to see the difference here. Yeah, that's a great idea.
So let me make some comments in that issue. And yeah, before we kind of dive into, okay, we need to create the user guide or this, I think actually just pausing and saying, okay, let's look at how things are organized. Let's look at, references like the Kubernetes docs here and figure out what's the best way that we structure this information.
Absolutely, agreed. Yeah, thank you for that idea. That'll be great to have a plan before we really dig into it. And I'd also, I think any comparison to the Ingress API is going to be remarkably helpful, because that's where, at least initially, a lot of potential users are going to be coming from. So yeah, this is a great idea, and hopefully we can find ways to also make it look relatively similar to this as well. Yeah, okay. I'm hoping that we can have our API mostly frozen, almost frozen. Well, frozen is a strong term, but very minimal changes by sometime next week. And then we can, it's a lot easier to work on documentation once the API is pretty stable. And I think we're nearly at that point. I hate to, as an example, one of the PRs I have right now flattens all HTTP route. I'd hate to have someone go to a lot of work to create all these, examples between ingress and HTTP route, and then everything gets flattened and you have to redo all the examples, as but hopefully we can get that in really quick, well, relatively quick, and just purely focus on documentation soon. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's all I had today. Any other things we should cover, or is that it?
I had a question, just out of curiosity. Somewhere in one of the PRs or the docs, I see reference to validating Webhook. And so would the Webhook, would that be part of the service API's repo, or would that be something that implementers are responsible for? Did I lose everyone? Hello?
I hear you.
I think we lost Rob.
Yeah, I hear you, Dane, but not Rob.
Yeah. Rob, you're on
Thank
mute.
you. I am definitely on mute. I was telling a great story and you missed it. Yeah, I thought I heard someone talking. I'm like, well, this is weird. Why would someone be talking when I'm talking? And yeah, anyway, here we are. Yeah, we have every intention of making that part of the core open source, not an implementation, but shared code base, if we want to call it that. So certainly a validating webhook, you know, just if you think of validation as something that is handled by open source, like by this repository, then bundling a validating webhook inside of it probably makes sense. What is less clear is how that validating webhook will be deployed. Even if the code lives here, the image is built here, maybe it makes more sense for, you know, implementations and their installation instructions to, I'm not sure there. I don't think we've answered that yet. But I know pretty certainly it does not make sense for every implementation to try and implement the same validation logic.
Yeah.
And as a kind of separate point, James had in one of the conditions that went into Gateway yesterday or today, whenever it was, as proposed by James, was a no such gateway class. I think that might be a reason, not a condition. I forget. But the idea that there is something on Gateway that indicates that there is no such gateway class. And I think there are a couple other examples of conditions or potential conditions we might want to add that are going to get messy if we require implementations to write them. Like that's a very specific example, because every controller watching that gateway is going to say there's no such gateway class. And if every controller tries to write that and one controller somehow thinks there is a gateway class matching that, you're going to have this like really terrible race where they're all kind of fighting each other. So there may be some space for some kind of shared component to update status as well, for not validation like things. But that has not been, I don't know of any kind of consensus or agreement there. That's just something that was mentioned in PR discussion. So. But yeah, I think that's something that we have said we'll actually worry about implementing once we release the V1 Alpha 1 API. So it will be based on the V1 Alpha 1 API, but we're not actually going to block the implementation, the API release on the implementation of that webhook. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Cool.
I appreciate that.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Was there anything else that I missed? Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been very helpful, and hopefully we can get a few more PRs in and keep on moving. We're getting close. All right. Talk to you all later.